This is called Let Me Learn from My Fear. And this says, I went through a lot of fear this weekend, more than I have ever felt before. I would like to learn from this experience. What would you share with me to help me? So let me just tell you what happened that weekend. This again was during that period of time when I had been guided to leave my job and leave my home in the Boston, Massachusetts area and come to North Carolina to be the caretaker of the Foundation for the Awakening Mind. So the steps that I had already taken, I had already sold my house. I was still living in it. The closing was not until sometime in June, but the house had been sold by this date, May 18th. I had already given notice at my job, and I had given them a date of like around June 20th or something, so that notice was given. Also, my daughter was in a school, a very, very good school, that in fact so many people apply to. You have to win a lottery to get into the school. And I had already given up her slot in that school for the next school year. So that was done. Even if we were somehow to stay in Boston, our house would be gone. She would not be able to get back into that school. Maybe I could have gotten my job back at the time, but even that was questionable because my boss was already interviewing people. So, we had pretty much moved out of Boston, and I came down to North Carolina for a weekend, a 4-day weekend, to find a house. And I had a lot of faith that I would find a house in one weekend because I trusted that Holy Spirit was guiding me here. And I had talked to a realtor in advance and given her some houses I was interested in seeing. And we had agreed to meet at 4 o'clock. She was going to pick me up at my brother's house at 4 o'clock on Thursday, and we were going to begin looking at houses. And I had Thursday evening, all day Friday, and Friday evening, and all day Saturday to look at houses. And then we were going to fly out again at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. Well, I got to my brother's house by 4 o'clock on Thursday, and I waited until 5, and the realtor never showed up. So I called her and to find out where she was, and she had mistaken. She had thought that I was going to come at 5 o'clock on Friday, which was really 24 hours later than I had arrived. Again, I'd planned to look Thursday evening and all day Friday, and she had planned for me to show up Friday evening. So we weren't able to go look at houses that evening, and I was okay with that. To me, it was one lost evening. She agreed to go with me the next morning, so I was okay with that. The next morning, we went and looked at houses. And none of the houses that we saw were at all acceptable to me. Any of the houses that were acceptable to me were in a school district that was unacceptable. I had just taken Jasmine out of one of the best schools in the country, and to put her in a truly substandard school was a step I was not ready to take, willing to take. It was a step I was not willing to take. So any of the houses that seemed okay were in school districts that really bothered me, or there was something about the house that I was really uncomfortable with. And it's funny because ego started getting into my mind and telling me that if I was going to live a life with Holy Spirit, I was going to have to sacrifice, and was showing me that I was either going to have to put my daughter in a school that I did not want to put her into, or I was going to have to live in a house that I did not want to live in. That this is the life of sacrifice that you've signed up for with the Holy Spirit. And I wasn't really okay with that message, but I was believing that message. So some fear started coming up. But we still had another day. We still had Saturday. So I asked the realtor if we could find some more houses and look at Saturday. And she said, oh, well, I have a garage sale at my house on Saturday morning, so I won't be able to take you out on Saturday. She said, maybe I can take you out for a couple hours on Saturday afternoon. Maybe we can look at a couple houses. And she did pick me up after her garage sale was over, but of course she hadn't given much attention to trying to help me find a house. So we only had a couple that I had found in a search, looked at them, same situation, just not at all anything that I wanted. And again, I still had that voice in my mind, this is a life of sacrifice you have chosen. And yet sacrifice was not what I wanted. So she probably dropped me off around 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, and I went into the room where I was staying at my brother's house, and I went into a deep, 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 deep fear, because I was buying that sacrifice story hook, line, and sinker. And as I listened to that sacrifice story that was playing in my mind, the way my mind went was I began to see that in Boston I had had everything. I had had this wonderful job that paid very well, that I loved, and the people loved and respected me. I lived in this wonderful neighborhood. In fact, Acton, the town that we lived in, was considered one of the most desirable places to live in the Boston area. I had this wonderful house with an attached apartment that I rented out, which helped with the income. I had a wonderful tenant. We had wonderful friends. Really, I was very happy. My daughter went to this wonderful school. Everything was so good. And I had let it all go. And as I was listening to this sacrifice story in my mind, I really began to suffer over that. I really began to suffer of everything I had let go. And a lot of fear came over me, a lot of fear. And I began to see in my mind that the truth was not true, that all that was real is the world, and that I had had it good in the world. And I had been totally stupid, totally fooled by this spiritual dream in my mind, and had given up a damn good life. And now I had nothing. This is where my mind was going. And I was shaking with fear. I had blown it as much as anybody could ever blow it. How could I have gotten to be so stupid? I had really blown it. And I remember just wondering, I remember the thought in my mind, how could I have fallen for all of this spiritual crap? And I was really low because I just thought I had just done the stupidest thing that anyone could ever do. But when I hit the lowest point of that fear, the lowest point of all, some sentences came into my mind. The first sentence, oh yes, Debbie is saying, and as a single parent, that can be a scary place. And I will say, Debbie, that being the single parent, the one responsible, was adding to all of this fear that I'm sharing. Because I had not only totally screwed it up for me, I had totally screwed it up for this little 8-year-old girl, right? Just totally screwed it. I had everything, and I had thrown it away on an illusion. This is the way the ego was speaking in my mind. The truth was an illusion. So when I hit that bottom point in my mind, some sentences came into my mind, and I know it's the Holy Spirit that put those sentences in my mind. The first sentence that came into my mind was, I am the Son of God. I am not the victim of the world I see. And then the second sentence that came into my mind from Peace Pilgrim. And I heard her whisper, the ego knows the weakest spot in your armor. And when you put those two sentences together in my mind, it really clicked that all I was doing was listening to the ego. And that true desire within me, that true desire that got me onto the spiritual path in the first place, began to arise again. And I began to want to come out of my fear and get back into the place of trusting the Holy Spirit. I began to want that again. And wanting that was really all that I needed, because once I began to want that again, I began to rise back up out of that fear. Now, it wasn't instantaneous. It was like crawling out of a deep, dark hole that I had fallen into. I couldn't really hear the Holy Spirit other than those two sentences which came into my mind. So I think I practically crawled into the other room because I was so shaking with fear that I could barely move. But I crawled into the other room and I grabbed A Course in Miracles and I said, Holy Spirit, please, please, please let me open this to exactly what I need to read right now. And then I randomly opened the book, and sure enough, it was perfect. It was absolutely perfect. So that gave me a little more strength and a little more desire to let go of my fear and rejoin with trust in the Holy Spirit. And I went upstairs, and I remember I was still really shaking, and I think my family even looked at me in a surprised way because they're not used to seeing me that way. I'm typically a very happy, upbeat person. But I went into the living room, and my daughter wanted me to play with her. And of course, as you can imagine, I couldn't really play with her. I just wanted to lay back down. So what I did was I took a blanket and I said, let's go outside. And I spread the blanket on my brother's front lawn. It was a beautiful day. And I laid down and I agreed to tell her a story. And then I said a quick prayer and I said, please, Holy Spirit, give me a story to share with her that will help me. And then I just began to talk, very spontaneous. And I don't remember what the story was now. It probably would have been nice if I had been strong enough to write it down. But I can tell you that as I told my daughter this story that came into my mind, I began to be lifted up even more. It was a perfect story for me at that time. Then the next thing that happened was a friend of mine walked up. This was actually a friend from high school, somebody I really hadn't seen much in the last 25 years, maybe once or twice in 25 years. I hadn't seen him a lot. But he came up to me, and and he was asking me what was wrong, and so I was telling him how I was afraid because I'd given up so much, and I'd come here to find a house, and I hadn't found a house, and now I was scared, and all of that. And he said to me, and I absolutely know these words were Holy Spirit given to his mind and then spoken to me. He said to me, there isn't really anything wrong. You just can't see that right now. And when he said that, it really hit me in the heart. I absolutely knew that that was true, that I was still being carried by God. And the only problem was I had lost that perspective. But somehow everything was going to be fine. And I was so grateful for that sentence, so grateful that he came up and said that to me. Then my brother came out and asked me actually I don't think he asked me, he just told me. He said, Regina, get in the car. And as I mentioned to you all before, I was in a very weakened state, so I was willing to follow orders. So I got in the car, and Jasmine came too. And we were going to pick up my nephew at his baseball practice. And my brother said, I just can't believe there aren't any houses around here, that will work for you. Let's go driving around. So he went driving around, and we were driving by houses. And none of them, none of them really stood out for me. And I had enough disappointments that I wasn't really excited. But I tried to be nice and act like I was showing some interest in the houses. But the truth is, I wasn't. And the kids started, getting bored in the back seat, bored of riding around. And finally I just said to my brother, I said, Roger, this was like 5 o'clock on Saturday evening, and we're supposed to fly out at 10 o'clock the next morning. And I said, Roger, I don't know how this is going to work out. I said, all I know is that somehow it is. We're not going to find a house now, but I trust everything's going to be fine. I don't know how, it just will. Let's go home. Let's take the kids home. My brother said, well, let's just turn down one more street. And the street that we turned down was Random Drive. The street that we randomly turned down, Random Drive. And as soon as we turned into the neighborhood, I felt good. I started feeling good. I started brightening. And sure enough, we pulled up in front of this house that was for sale. They had pamphlets out front with pictures so I could see inside, and I knew that it would work. I knew that it was fine. And we called the realtor on the sign, and within 2 hours, I was inside the house and making an offer. By the time I left at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, I had a house. It was just like my friend had said. There wasn't ever really anything wrong. I just couldn't see that. So that's the experience of the weekend. Again, I went through a lot of fear, and yet everything turned out fine. So let's go back to my question now that we have the perspective of the weekend. All right, so let me go ahead then and read this message from Holy Spirit that followed that weekend of fear. Question, I went through a lot of fear this weekend, more than I have ever felt before. I would like to learn from this experience. What would you share with me to help me? And the Holy Spirit at first gave me a one-word answer, accept. And then the Holy Spirit continued. This is a key word for you. It does mean that you need to stop planning to be happy. You are always planning to be happy, when happiness is in the current moment, not in your plans for the future. It is okay to want to learn from your experience of this past weekend, but be careful not to slip into judging yourself for having done one thing wrong or another thing better. Just accept the weekend as it happened. Being grateful is a form of acceptance. So continue to be grateful as you are. The future is going to come just as it will. For you to plan every detail now is to waste your moments now. It may not feel like worrying to you, but it is the same thing. Let the future go until it gets here, until it is now. Everything will fall into place, including your furniture. Be at peace, accept, and be grateful. Love the current moment and all that is happening in it. This is not the formula for fear. It is the formula for peace. Enjoy the formula for peace, and fear will be impossible. I'll continue in just a moment. But what Holy Spirit is really saying is that the error that I made in my mind, it really goes back to what my friend said. Remember, my friend said there really isn't anything wrong. You just can't see that right now. So really what was happening is, if we look at that moment, at the moment when I was experiencing this deep, deep fear, I did still have a house to live in for another month in Boston. I did still have a job. I was comfortably at my brother's house, around my family who loved me. I was not homeless in that moment. I was not starving in that moment. There was nothing wrong with Jasmine in that moment. All of my fear came from projecting into the future and imagining this horrible situation that was not occurring in the moment. I was planning for things to be horrible. And that's where all the thoughts about the spiritual crap came from. I was planning to have to sacrifice. And none of that ever even came true. It was all made up. And all of that fear, that horrible fear that I experienced, came to me because of the imaginings that I was allowing in my mind. So what Holy Spirit is saying is that, my mind, Regina's mind, is always projected into the future. She's imagining either her happiness in the future, or in this particular case, she's imagining that her happiness did not happen in the future. And so what I'm experiencing in the present is only my imagination. If I'm imagining that everything is working out in the future, then I may be experiencing what feels like happiness. But this weekend, when I was imagining everything not working out in the future, I was experiencing fear. But the Holy Spirit is pointing out to me that I am always imagining, always planning out into the future, and pointed out that that is actually a type of worry, when what I really need to do is stay with the current moment. And if I stay with the current moment in a very real way, and accept the current moment, and be grateful for the current moment, I will be at peace. And of course, what we also know